Hi, my name is Dr. Eric Landrum from the Department of Psychology at Boise State University, and this is the screencast about critical thinking. Now, the term critical thinking has been around for quite some time and has a number of different definitions. I want to show you just a handful of those just to kind of show you the complexity of the topics involved here. When I think about critical thinking, it's really not just one topic, but it's a bunch of topics. And it does depend on the definition. So it could be about a conscious process, challenging a claim or an opinion, reasonable and reflective thinking. You can see some examples of different definitions there. I like this one by Diane Halpern, who's actually been a researcher in the critical thinking area for quite some time. And I think this really kind of gets at that complexity of cognitive skills, calculations, forming inferences. It's a very specific type of thinking task. And so really, it's a big and broad kind of overview to this whole entire topic of research methods. Now, the definition and the examples that I like to use come from Wade and Tavris, and I like this definition because it's kind of big and broad. So, critical thinking strategies are designed to make us better consumers of information. And hopefully, the thing that you instantly ask yourself is what kinds of information, and I would say all kinds. And so, I'm not talking about just academic decisions and studying and being a good college student. It could be a shopper at your favorite grocery store, buying a used car, deciding which web apps to download to your smartphone. And so it's really about the consumption of information and how to be a better consumer. And what Wade and Tavris did is that they kind of outlined this in terms of 9 different processes or sequence or steps, and I want to actually briefly go through those 9 with you with examples because I think that that kind of multi-pronged approach will show you the complexity and the importance of this topic of critical thinking. So let's get going. So if we're going to try to answer that question of what is critical thinking, part of it is about being skeptical, asking questions, being willing to wonder. This is typically not a problem at all for psychology majors. You can play the what if game. What would happen if I started to study the night before the exam? I wonder what would happen if I could actually discover the cause of clinical depression. What would happen if I worked on that term paper 2 nights before instead of the night before, the morning of it was due? And so be skeptical, ask questions, be willing to wonder what would happen in a differently configured world if we had more definitive information about a topic that you're passionate about. In essence, be curious about the puzzles of human behavior. And again, this is typically not an issue for psych majors. In fact, if you're a psychology major and you're not curious about the puzzles of human behavior, that would be an interesting situation. I'll just leave it at that. Another aspect of critical thinking is to define the problem and examine the definition of terms. And we're all about this in psychology because the terms are specific and they're meaningful, and the definitions will help shape the type of research that we do and the conclusions that are drawn. And so in psychology, we have a special term for this approach. It's called operational definitions. And so we want to take these big, broad, hypothetical constructs and make them more concrete and give them definitions that we can finesse and debate and argue about to make sure that they are reliable and valid. So, these big, broad things like intelligence or depression or hunger or success or self-efficacy, these big, broad things in psychology, we want to have a tight operational definition so that everyone knows when we say we're measuring success, what that actually means. The example I like to use and why you see the graphic of on the screen of your favorite Mongolian barbecue dish is hunger. And so think about the different ways that we might measure hunger. We might measure it by asking a person on a 1 to 10 scale, how hungry are you? We might weigh them at the beginning of the month and at the end of the month. And if you've lost weight, we're going to declare that to be hungry. If you've gained weight, it's not hungry. We might measure the amount of money that you spend at your grocery store, and the more you spend, the more hungry you are. You can see that we could debate each of those, and we're not going to do that obviously in this screencast, but I like this definition. If you kind of think about the Mongolian barbecue, we could measure hunger as a function of noodle height. In other words, someone who makes the stack that's 3 inches tall is not as hungry as someone who makes the stack 7 inches tall. And again, that's the operational definition. But then psychologists share that openly and publicly, and we can debate about it. We can say, no, that's not really a good definition of hunger. And quite honestly, the definition of hunger would probably be multifaceted. We'd probably try to triangulate this and get at hunger from different perspectives before we kind of settled on who's hungry and who's not, different levels or types of hunger. So critical thinkers define that problem, but then we're going to spend a great deal of time examining the definition of the terms as we're going to share it publicly. Another characteristic of critical thinking is to examine the evidence. So first off, this is the presumption that we actually want evidence, which we do. Now, we want evidence that has certain characteristics, and we'll get into that in the next couple of slides. But one of those characteristics is that we want it to be replicable. That is, it's reproducible, repeatable. And you can see kind of a snippet of an article that came out in 2015 where 100 classic studies in psychology were replicated by different researchers around the country. And what was really interesting, it's kind of a good news, bad news. The good news was it's really cool to do this because we should be replicating our results. There's an old saying in science that goes, if it hasn't happened twice, it hasn't happened. And so if something is a meaningful result, it should happen each time you do the study, as long as you repeat the study the same way it was originally done. So the good news is researchers all around the country actually worked on this. The bad news was from this report, only about 36% of the studies replicated, which is a little bit disappointing for sure. But it actually points to this, at least psychologists were willing to point the lens at themselves. And some good things came out of that. So, for example, we see the power and the value of replication, but also the studies that didn't replicate had relatively weak or marginal results, but the studies that had big, robust results originally did tend to replicate. And so, the methodologies that we're using tend to be okay, but it might be the decisions that we're making about what is significant, what is important. Those decisions might need to change a little bit in terms of editorial decisions and acceptance rates and things like that for journals. But the critical thinker wants evidence. And it pains me to admit this, but not a lot of people are really going to care about Eric Landrum's opinion about psychology. But they might care about my opinion a lot more if I can back it with evidence. And so I can state my opinion, but I've got evidence from different sources and journal articles and books and websites that might back up my claims. That makes me much more persuasive into the scientific community. So critical thinkers want evidence. Now, on top of that, we want certain types of evidence, and we want to be cautious in drawing conclusions from evidence. Different types of evidence allow for different types of conclusions. And so the classic example that we tend to talk about in research methods is a correlational result versus a causal result. And so, the gold standard really is cause and effect. We really want to know, as a psychologist, I want to know what causes Alzheimer's disease. I want to know what causes clinical depression. I want to know what causes my students to be successful in graduate school or my students to be successful in their job with a bachelor's degree in psychology. I want to know what causes self-efficacy. I want to know what causes healthy behavioral choices in terms of health psychology. And so I want to know all that stuff, but the methods that I have to research some of those topics are going to limit the strength of my conclusions because a correlational study will not allow for a cause and effect conclusion. There's this classic example from Canada that happened years ago. A long time ago, they actually changed their packaging and their laws in Canada and they said essentially that 40% of the cover, a minimum 40% of the cover, had to be an anti-smoking type of campaign when they're advertising cigarettes. And so I went to Canada. I'm not a smoker, but I'd heard about this from a health psychologist friend of mine. I was in the airport. I had this funny money, and so I said, give me 5 packs of cigarettes. And so the lady across the counter gave me these 5 packs. I'm going to show you all the covers here eventually. And you can see that, they have, where there's smoke, there's hydrogen cyanide. Cigarettes cause lung cancer. Here's a couple more. Cigarettes cause smoke with a diseased brain being pointed out to the reader. Cigarettes hurt babies. And then the last one that I have is this large one. Cigarettes cause mouth disease. And the Canadian government did some really cool stuff, and so they looked at smoking rates before the implementation of the advertising campaign and afterwards. And what they found over a little bit of time is about cigarette smoking went down about 3% in Canada. Now that might not sound like a lot, but if you're talking about, just the change in advertising, and 3% actually could be very meaningful in terms to the lives saved because of the reduction in cigarette smoking. And but it's not a cause and effect study. I didn't have a treatment group and a control group. It wasn't all else held equal. This is kind of a study in nature as things are going on. There could be other third factors coming into play. And I don't know this for sure, but maybe at the same time with the advertising change, there was a tax hike on cigarettes. Or maybe they became more difficult to buy because vendors didn't want to have them on display in public places. I don't know that, but I'm speculating. But you can see where there could be alternative explanations that we have to think about. Now, just anecdotally, as I was in the airport that time and talking to the lady behind the counter, I asked her, do you think it really makes any difference? Do people say anything to you? And they say, yeah, all the time they'll come by and say, I want 2 packs of cigarettes, not the baby and not the teeth. And so, anecdotally, it clearly made a difference. It looked like with some national data from Canada, about 3% reduction in smoking over time. But again, that's not cause and effect. And so that's the notion here: is that be careful in drawing conclusions from evidence, and the type of evidence that you have is linked to the type of conclusion that you can draw. Just the third part of this little trio about this little evidentiary trio is that, and I've already kind of alluded to this, you want to consider alternative explanations for research evidence. So, other influencing third factors that are out there. And so again, maybe a tax hike caused a decrease in smoking. Maybe the lesser availability of cigarettes in public places might have caused a decrease in cigarette smoking. We're never really going to know the cause and effect because it wasn't a true experiment. It wasn't a true study, a randomized controlled trial. And we'll talk about those topics in later screencasts in this course. Another characteristic of critical thinking is to examine biases and assumptions. And this is an important one, both of your own and those of others. Look for these spins, filters, prejudices. And I would encourage you strongly to consider evidence that may contradict your beliefs. This is one of the key things about going to college. You should be around people who don't think like you, who don't feel like you, who don't look like you, who don't talk like you, and to have this appreciation for perspectives other than your own. I'm not saying that you need to adopt those other perspectives, but college should challenge you to think about the world differently. And then you make your decision whether I want to stick to my beliefs or maybe might want to change my worldview. We all have these biases and assumptions, me included. So one of my biases, and I hope you'll get this over the course of research methods with me, is that I think this course is important. I don't think this is a course to get out of the way. I think there are some life skills in here, no matter what you do with your bachelor's degree, that will serve you well in your day-to-day life, making decisions, making big purchases, trying to make a decision between going to graduate school or a good job with your bachelor's degree, or other types of major decisions. This idea of looking for evidence and digesting information with a certain amount of savvy will make you less vulnerable to scams and myths and misperceptions. I really do believe that. Just another quick example of my own biases and assumptions is that when I teach the Introduction to Psychology course, I teach Sigmund Freud because he's an important figure in the historical development of psychology, but I'm not a big fan. It's very dark. It's very negative. It's just not very uplifting, and so I don't personally believe in a lot of it. But I think students ought to be able to make their own decision. And so when I teach the course, I try to hide that bias and assumption, my own personal one, and let students, come up with their own biases and assumptions or whatever they're going to believe. And so that's important to have students make up their own mind about these topics. Another characteristic of critical thinking is to avoid emotional reasoning as a substitute for rationality. Now, this is difficult. Feelings should not substitute for the careful appraisal of arguments and evidence. We are emotional beings. That's that third rail. We get outraged. We get excited. We have this road rage. We want to do stuff. And sometimes we're not making our best decisions. And to be honest with you, this is occasionally augmented by the consumption of alcohol. So the consumption of alcohol has in many times not led to the finest decision making by people around the world. And so I'm not saying to ignore your emotions, but don't let them substitute in. A lot of times, some good advice is to sleep on it. If you're angry about something and if you're fired up and you're in a rage about it, before you go to bed, if you're still in that rage the next morning, that maybe that's a good telling sign. If you've calmed down over time, maybe you kind of change your reaction to that situation, and it could be more rational. And so, I'm not saying to ignore this, but just try to avoid, running that third rail, because sometimes it just gets us into trouble when we just react on our emotions rather than acting a little bit more rationally. All right, we're heading into the home stretch here, and I think personally, for me at least, these are some of the harder ones of the entire list. The critical thinker tries not to oversimplify and not overgeneralize. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a very complicated world, and I would encourage you, whenever possible, to reject simplistic either or thinking, to look beyond the obvious. It's not a black and white world we live in. It's really all about shades of gray. And a lot of times, the real answer to an important question is going to be either it depends or I don't know. So, so the topic of research methods is actually very complex. This course is almost like an introduction to research methods, and so you should know that yes, even though I've just told you not to oversimplify and overgeneralize, in this course I will be simplifying and generalizing because students need to wrap their head around the basic principles, and then we can get more complicated when you go off to graduate school or you do advanced research with a faculty member as a research assistant. Then you'll get greater details and greater depth, which might actually contradict with some of the kind of basic simplistic principles I'm trying to provide. Again, I want you to wrap your head around it. Another example would be if you've got a 3-year-old and you're cooking in the kitchen, you've got your stove burners on, and that child is curious what's going on top of the stove, and he or she starts reaching, and you're in the kitchen with them. You don't sit there and talk about, don't do that, Johnny, because the heat transfer is going to cause third-degree burns on your skin, and then this, and then you just don't do that. You might go, stop it. And you are oversimplifying and overgeneralizing for that child because they're not really going to understand the concepts deeply at 3, but at 13 you ought to be able to explain to him or her about why you want to make the decision differently than reaching for the burners on the stove. And so we do oversimplify, we do overgeneralize, but whenever we can avoid it, we should try not to. This gets us into trouble sometimes because we like to simplify, we like to cubbyhole, we like to get our world nice and neat and organized, and it's messy and it's complicated. And let me give you enough examples. Let me give you enough examples where I come around and maybe I can offend everybody. But it's pretty hard to say something accurate about all Catholics or all Muslims or all Asians or all white males or black females. It's a big, complicated world, and to cubbyhole or to put everybody in a big group, just is going to do a disservice to the individual members of that group. Just as you don't want to be seen as one unitary member of some organization or group or ethnic designation or demographic, it's complicated. And so just whenever we can, we try not to oversimplify, we try not to overgeneralize. And this is the last one of the sequence of 9 characteristics of critical thinking, is to tolerate uncertainty. That is to settle on guiding beliefs, yet be willing to change those in the face of changing evidence. And you see a picture here of Dr. David Eagleman. He's a professor in the Baylor University School of Medicine. And this is actually a screenshot from his TED Talk on possibilianism. And actually, you can see the YouTube link there. It's awesome. It's about 22 minutes long. I actually show it in my research methods class. It's just an amazingly well created video about this notion of tolerating uncertainty and the strength of being able to say, I don't know, or I don't know yet. So the basic notion here is that we settle on guiding beliefs based on the best evidence available, and as that evidence changes, we might have to change our decision or change our beliefs. You've probably heard this sexist notion of it's a woman's prerogative to change her mind. I'm going to suggest it's all of our prerogative to change our mind. That is, it shouldn't be just women, it should be men and women. And so, if the evidence changes, we got to think about changing our stance on a topic. Whether that, and these are big, broad, complex topics we often think about, whether it's poverty or homelessness or domestic abuse or terrorism. As the evidence changes over time, health benefits, eating bacon and eggs, tolerating uncertainty. You may have to weigh different studies that say bacon and eggs are good today and they're bad tomorrow. And how do you weigh that conflicting evidence? Well, you weigh it by being a critical thinker, by understanding evidence, by actually reading the study and not the journalist summary of the study, and by making a decision for yourself about, was that cause and effect conclusion drawn appropriately? Did someone mistakenly have a correlational impact, but they drew a cause and effect conclusion? That critical thinker dives deep into those issues and makes his or her own decision about how to deal with the data that are presented to them. All right, just to kind of wrap this up, some of the attitudes of a critical thinker, I think this is a nice list to kind of bring it and make it more realistic. Critical thinking is hard work. I don't think we do this 24/7. I think if you did this every waking hour of the day, you'd have a headache all the time. There's a great way to relieve yourself from critical thinking. It's called television. And television can be a nice little respite from the hard work of critical thinking. To a critical thinker, errors and mistakes provide valuable feedback. Those are opportunities to learn. And I think students at some level intuitively know this. If you got a 90 on a paper, most students don't bask in the glory of the 90 points they earned, but they investigate the 10 points that they lost. And I would say to take that notion and then make it into a learning experience. So how can I not make those mistakes the next time on the next draft or the next assignment? Another attitude of a critical thinker is that every major issue has multiple points of view. And so, it's a complex world that we live in. And you may have your own viewpoint, and that's good for you. But I would encourage you to understand the viewpoints of others. It's much more persuasive in a debate if I can say, here's what I believe, and here's why. And here's what you believe, and I understand that's why you believe it. Now let's talk about why we don't believe the same things. It's much more effective than neener neener. You're not very smart. It's not. It's not. It's much more effective than name calling to talk about I understand and appreciate your point of view. Now here, let me tell you why I don't agree with it. All right. And it's perfectly acceptable to change beliefs if presented with the appropriate evidence. That's that characteristic number 9, tolerate uncertainty. And so you might change your belief about a political candidate or a health choice that you're making with regard to diet or exercise. That's good. That's the attitude of a critical thinker. You change your beliefs in the face of changing evidence. And finally, there are no simplistic solutions to complex human problems. If you've thought about this world that we live in at all, you know this already. If there were an easy fix for poverty, we would have fixed poverty. If there was an easy fix for homelessness, we would have fixed it. An easy fix for childhood obesity, if it was for domestic violence, if it was for terrorism, we would have fixed those already. Those are complex human problems that are going to require complex human solutions. The good news about that, the silver lining, is that means that psychology majors will usually have job security. The world's not becoming an easier place to live in, it's becoming more difficult. That means that we need more experts in their training about human behavior. Finally, to wrap this up, if you overhear these snippets of conversations, that probably means that critical thinking has been dialed down or perhaps even tuned out. So if you hear someone say, just shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, odds are you're not really examining the evidence anymore and you're not really looking for alternative explanations. You've just kind of shut down. Or if someone says to you, I don't care what your evidence is, anyone can find anything to support what they want. You know what? That's probably true, but the critical thinker, I want you to examine the evidence. I want you to look at the data, not just the conclusions. I want you to be able to read a research article and go to the results section and interpret it for yourself and not read someone else's summary of that for you. And so we are going to have conflicting evidence from time to time. We have it all the time, but we still have to live our lives. We still have to make decisions. And so, the classic one that I won't get into too much would be vaccines. There's a lot of evidence on both sides, and rather than take, the popular viewpoints, I would encourage you to dig into the actual data, the evidence, and then make your own decision about vaccines for you or your children. Don't argue with me. I'm older and I know what's right. And you can substitute, don't argue with me. I'm the parent. I'm your father. I'm the teacher and I know it's right. This really isn't critical thinking. My status in life as being older or your father or your teacher doesn't instantly mean I'm any smarter. And so there may be wisdom there, there may not be. And we all know people who are 20 and who are quite wise and who are 70 who are not wise. And so taking this claim and staking this claim really doesn't make a lot of sense. We want to debate the topics. We want to examine the definition of terms. We want to be willing to wonder and solve those puzzles of human behavior. This is one that kind of shows you that someone's shut down also. My feelings about this are very strong, and no matter what you say, I won't change my mind. Well, the critical thinker needs to be open to changing their mind, especially in the face of changing evidence. And so if you hear that, that probably means that a lot of critical thinking isn't happening. And the last one here in the series is, I was raised that way. Now, here's the thing. Here's what I mean by that. If your parents are Republican and you want to be Republican because your parents were, I'm going to suggest to you gently, that's not really critical thinking. You're just kind of being lazy and adopting what you grew up with. Now, if your parents are Republican and then as you grow older, you examined these different political parties, you looked at party platforms, you looked at voting records, you read the candidates who are running right now, you read their interest statements on the internet, and then you decide to be Republican, and your parents also happen to be Republican, I think that's great because you were a critical thinker. You weighed the evidence. You looked for alternative explanations. You were puzzled and you went and you examined. That's awesome. And I would say the same thing for religion or other belief systems or cultural adaptations. Being raised gives you good exposure to one aspect of human life, but I would encourage you to examine other aspects and to explore other religions or cultures or ethnicities or beliefs other than your own. And then you might settle on the ones that you're familiar with, but at least you've explored and then you've made a decision for yourself. Anyway, those are the kind of the notions of critical thinking, and these were examples here on this screen about what isn't critical thinking. That's it for me, and this is your Psych 321 Research Methods screencast on critical thinking.